Well, hi there, folks, and welcome to the very first big show with Chris Meaux in a long time. Been months, in fact. I segued to the big radio show for a number of reasons, primarily ease, because it's easier to do an audio show. Setting up the camera, having to get guests, having the guests come to your house, they don't know who you are, then they, break into your house and try to steal your stuff. It's just too big of a risk. Too much of a risk, kids. Anyway, no, none of that happened, but it was easier to do that. Now, I'm still doing the big radio show with Chris Meaux, all right? That's not going away. But I wanted to come back with the big show, and actually the reason that I'm doing this big show today is for a very specific reason. By the way, if you can tell, I'm out of breath because I walked 10 steps. Oh, God. Woo! All right, I'm better. I'm no Superman, despite my accoutrement. Speaking of Superman, that's why I'm doing this big show today, kids. Why? Because today is November the 18th, 2012. Today is the 20th anniversary of a very important event in the history of comic books and pop culture. It is, in fact, the 20th anniversary of the death of Superman. Now, the reason that you folks out there ever hear news stories about comic book stuff, any kind of story that happens in the comics, okay? Maybe Spider-Man, there's a new Spider-Man and he's not Peter Parker anymore. That was in the news last year. There's a new Ultimate Spider-Man. It's a different comic book from the one with Peter Parker in it, but he was this guy who is, I think, Puerto Rican and African American ancestry. So he was the first ethnic Spider-Man. That was a big story. Let's see what else. Oh, well, there was a big story about both Marvel and DC had openly gay superheroes. That was a story earlier this year, I think. Or no, it might have been late last year. And then other stories. Right now, Spider-Man apparently is going to be out of his comic book. DC Comics, which does the Justice League, Superman, Batman, etc., they had a big story in 2011 when they restarted all of their comic books to kind of refresh them for a new age of people who don't know anything about comic books and to get new readers in. And in doing that, they had new #1 issues, and so, became like the 90s all over again with what, in the 90s, there was a speculator market where people thought comic books would equal ching money. And so they bought comic books by the armloads. I mean, these people spent a lot of money, and not that I ever did. I did actually, but I was a collector and a reader first. I was not in it primarily for money. And it's fitting that we talk about that because what it is that I'm talking about today, the event that this is the 20th anniversary of, is one of the biggest events during that time frame, during the 1990s, the early 90s, that actually led to a lot of speculation, a lot of people buying just, hundreds of copies. Some people bought hundreds of copies themselves for one person, thinking later on they would make them rich. And it didn't, right? 20 years later, those issues are not worth as much as they might think they are or hope they are. But anyway, the death of Superman was a big deal because of a number of reasons. One, for you who are maybe not a comic book fan and you're maybe not the 1990s, you were maybe just being born or, were like 3 years old, or you just didn't care, didn't pay attention to comics, I talk to a lot of people and they're like, wait, comic books are still being published? They still get made? And I'm like, yeah, they do. You can get them on your iPad. They're digital now. But they also have these hard copies, which we'll look at here in a minute. You can still go to a comic book shop. Also, like Barnes & Noble, Books A Million has them as well. And you can pick them up there. And so this was a big deal because back then in that time in the early 90s, there was a term about what was popular called grim and gritty. And what grim and gritty was superheroes who were very dark. And there's nothing, I think, wrong with dark necessarily, right? Like Batman, very dark character. I'm a big fan of Batman. But there was also the violent, what we call in literature the anti-hero. And that was a big, big thing back then. You had characters like the Punisher, who is a vigilante who kills criminals, kills bad guys. You have characters like Wolverine from the X-Men, who, if you've only seen the movies with Wolverine, you may not realize it. In the comics, he was very violent. You didn't see one drop of blood, probably, in any X-Men or Wolverine movie. But in the comics, his claws were often covered with blood. There were a lot of dark, violent characters. There was a guy named Spawn, who was big in the 90s. He was his deal was that he was an assassin. There's a gig you hope to get your kids to aspire to. Assassin. He was an assassin who went to hell, and the devil made a deal with him, or a devil, they reveal later, to be basically an assassin for the devil. So, that's a hero, right, folks? Spawn, very violent, very dark. There's an issue where this guy, Spawn, actually finds a child molester who's an ice cream truck driver, and he's kidnapping children, and then, doing horrible things to them, and then murdering them. And he keeps them in this big freezer. Just horrible. Like, why is that in a comic book? And then you had Spawn come in, and Spawn, in the end, ends up chaining him up and killing him by impaling him with popsicle sticks. Yes, all over his body. So this was a dark, dark era, and a lot of people would say it reflected the times that it was being created in, that culture in general, pop culture, or any media, reflects the times that it's made in, and I think that's pretty accurate. So DC Comics had the very first superhero. Many would argue the very greatest. And I'm always tied. My two favorite superheroes are Superman and Batman. They've always been, and sometimes, they're tied for that place. I have a special place in my heart for both of them. And sometimes I just feel like maybe I have a bigger space in my heart for Superman, or a bigger space for Batman. But Superman, for me, I was that kid that hated the kind of clean-cut hero. I was into the dark stuff. I was into the Spawn. I actually read Spawn. I was into that kind of book. I was into Ghost Rider, who wasn't that violent, but he was a guy with a flaming skull, very metal character, Wolverine. And I had grown up knowing about Superman. I had grown up familiar with the character, liking the Chris Reeve movies as a kid. But when I got into comics, it was because of Batman. And Batman is not a killer, thankfully, but he's pretty violent. He's pretty intense. And so I didn't follow I didn't follow anything other than that kind of stuff. Wolverine, the X-Men, which was violent, and this and that. And DC, being very smart, the writers and the creators of the Superman comics at the time were very smart, and they realized that violence, for the sake of violence, all the cool superheroes, except for like Spider-Man, but they were very violent. In fact, the anti-hero was seen as more cool than the hero. An anti-hero is not a villain, but an anti-hero is a person who basically does things we would not usually consider heroic. And we're not talking about like killing in the line of duty. We're talking about murdering because it's easy, right? Because it's the easiest thing to do. Oh, look, some bad guys, they're bad, I'm going to just murder them because that's easy to do. And so a hero found another way, and that was what Superman was about. That's what Batman is about even. And so I was reading these comics, and I can remember the death of Superman being announced and thinking, and this is pre-internet, kids, and thinking, oh, well, I actually wasn't reading comics long enough to know that this would probably not be permanent. And I thought, this is it. Superman's gone. So I wanted to get these comic book issues, and I honestly was not that impressed with the character at the time. But what DC did very brilliantly was they had characters in the story of the death of Superman expressing what people thought about Superman in 1992. Oh, Superman is that's my grandfather's superhero, and he's a big Boy Scout. He never does anything exciting and boring. And then, and I don't have... I'm gonna actually put one of these videos in here for you to see. But there were actually kids back then, okay, that were interviewed during the Death of Superman event, because it got huge press coverage in '92. That said that Superman was lame. They were glad he was being killed, which I thought was really kind of terrible and not cool. There's one kid who's wearing a bow tie, and he's like maybe 12, and he's saying Superman's not cool. I don't know. You might need to look in the mirror, kid. But anyway, now bow ties are back in style, but back then you could get your butt kicked for wearing a bow tie. I know because I thought about it really hard. But anyway, so Superman 75, this issue here, came out on this day in 1992. 20 years ago today, this issue, Superman number 75, And in this issue, and I'm not going to open this one because let me just tell you a little bit about what I have here and how this whole storyline evolved. That's why I wanted to do this on video, kids, because you really miss some things in audio. I can't really show you this. This was the first appearance, this issue here. I don't have an auto zoom, I don't have a remote, but this is the first appearance of this character known as Doomsday. This is not a guy who had been hanging around as a villain. In fact, this was his first appearance in comic books, his first full appearance. And so it was kind of like, wow, who the hell is this? And it's, you know, he's actually punching the Superman, the Man of Steel logo at the top. There were 4 Superman titles at the time. So you could buy 4 different Superman books and they would continue the story throughout the 4 each month. And that way you got a weekly dose of Superman. And it says the beginning of the end, Doomsday, and he looks like trouble. He looks kind of like the Hulk, but he's wearing this kind of these chains, these restraints. Then it went from that to the next issue where Doomsday was fighting the Justice League at the time. And if you don't know who any of these people are in there, that's okay, because they were very lame. The Justice League were not the big characters at the time. You're not going to find Wolverine, I'm sorry, wrong company. You're not going to find Wonder Woman or the Flash. They weren't in Justice League at the time. They were in the beginning, and then they would come back later on. The current comics today have those characters in it. Then you had, in Superman number 74, you had Superman with the Justice League fighting Doomsday. He's finally, in this issue, he meets Doomsday face to face. And then the next few issues, it's all Superman Doomsday. These two cats go at it. Here's the next issue in the story where Superman is giving a flying, I guess, headbutt to Doomsday, which, again, this is Superman. So to be doing this, you got to be able to take some punishment. Here's a great issue that, a great cover that I've always liked. As the story ratcheted up, there they are fighting. And now the big problem is Doomsday is getting nearer to Metropolis. And this is the second to last issue, the penultimate issue before Big 75. And there you can see Superman bloodied. And it looks like, you know, there's no turning back. Superman's going to die. Now, what's really cool about all these comics is that the very first one I showed you, there were 4 panels per page. That's how, you know, if you've ever read a news strip, like you've maybe never opened a comic book, but you've read a news strip, like in a comic strip, I should say, in a newspaper, you know panels. Those are the boxes that the cartoons are in. In comic books, that is used. Panels are used as kind of the shot, right? The screen, the camera. And the first issue that I showed you started with 4 per page. And then the next issue went down to 3. The next issue went down to 2. And then when we got to this issue, Superman number 75, the entire comic book is actually full, what we call it in comic books a splash page. And so they're full page drawings. And you might be thinking, man, it would be great for you to open that and show us. Not going to happen. Sorry, I'm not opening these. These are... People ask me, Chris, do you have a lot of comic books that are worth a lot? I don't have any that are worth a whole lot. I mean, if I sold my collection, I'd probably make a decent amount of money. These here are my most prized comic books right here because this story was so important to me and it really made me a comic book fanatic. Because before that, I had been reading Batman and a little bit of Marvel and X-Men and stuff like that. But Superman, the death of Superman, brought me full on into Superman and then full on into the rest of the DC comics, a lot of other Marvel stuff, and it made me a lover of comic books, which before then I was kind of like, just kind of, you know, reading this and that, and then I jumped full on. Now,